Hey everyone, so testing out my new nighttime setup. I'm eventually going to have a lot of art and stuff. It's coming in the mail in a week. And I'm going to buy like a new desk and everything. And so the birds won't be in the background, they'll just be audible if people like that, because I do. And then I'm going to be facing towards a wall with all kinds of sick art on it. But for now, I want to make a quick video just on Alexander the Great because I read an entire biography about him like 5 years ago. And it's one of the only biographies, I've only read two biographies cover to cover in my life. It's Lance Armstrong and Alexander the Great. So I wanted to just talk about my key takeaways so that if you don't want to spend all that time reading a documentary about him, you can just kind of know like what I remember from those years. And so what will stick with you, just like everything else I do with this channel. Like the goal is for me to just kind of give you the key takeaways on stuff, just like what other YouTubers do who I love, like that one dude, like real life lore and Wendover Productions, sick videos. Let's get to it. Alexander the Great. Okay, the key question for me, guys, is whether or not he was great. And if you can follow that question and all it means, like really everything. Was it Alexander the Great, Alexander the Terrible, or Alexander the Dumb? And that can kind of just guide you towards understanding him and all the history. So was he great? Well, let me explain, okay? His father, I believe his name was Philip. I went to his grave. Philip the Great. He should definitely be called the Great. Unquestionably. I would say it should be Philip the Great and then Alexander the Haughty. Or Alexander, Alexander the Hubris. Or Alexander the Prideful. Philip of Macedonia was no joker, guys. No joker at all. And the entire time, guys, this is insane. You want to know something that's completely insane? Alexander the Great went all the way to India before he was able to pacify Sparta and the other Greeks. And Greek mercenaries were fighting on the side of the Persians. It was almost like a Greek civil war that like spilled out. It's crazy. So Philip is the one who would have united Greece and then maybe gone to take out the Persian Empire, maybe just let them rot. Doesn't matter really. Whereas people accused Alexander of not being strong enough to gain the Spartans' respect. And so he ran off to take over a crumbling empire. So it's kind of like Peter the Great of Russia, okay? Like Peter the Great of Russia, if I believe, is the one who got Russia all of Siberia, like all that wasteland. And they kind of accused Alexander of like, yeah, you couldn't pacify the Spartans, so you left your general back behind to fight the Greeks, the real man. And then you just kind of ran off to take stuff for free, basically. Like at Gilgamesh, when he won, outnumbered. He was outnumbered so much that it shouldn't even matter how big the numbers were. He was very outnumbered. He should have lost, but he won with tactics and morale. Morale. I mean, how did Cyrus the Great of Persia start the Persian Empire? Same way Alexander did. By kind of doing like Pablo Escobar's bullet or silver, like plato or plata. Like either if you surrender to us, we're super chill, and if you don't, we kill you. Wow, okay. Without mercy. Okay, wow, that's pretty extreme. But it worked back then. And that's what Cyrus did. And you have to really understand that Alexander the Great, his entire life, literally his entire life was centered around emulating Cyrus the Great and being worthy of the same legacy and the same surname and building the Hellenic Empire. God, I forget what it's even called. Alexander's empire that persisted in, I think, 3 parts after he died. They're trying to find their way because the sun goes down, so the doves try to find a place to sleep. I have 2 doves. They're wonderful too. Zebra doves, if you want to look up what they look like. Man, where was I? I was talking about Cyrus the Great. Thanks, Jasmine. Yeah, so I was talking about how Alexander's whole life was centered around trying to emulate Cyrus and his legacy. And a lot of that, I personally think that that's because of what Aristotle taught him. Aristotle was not one of his central tutors, but I do think Aristotle probably told him about eudaimonia, as the modern Greeks say, or eudaimonia, which is Aristotle's idea of, basically his idea of the perfect man. If I had to really summarize it up, really just all at once, it's tattooed on my skin. It means a lot more than that. But you can kind of just plug it in as, what's the goal of the eye? It's to see. What's the goal of the tongue? It's to taste and help speak. What's the goal of the teeth? To help chew. And what's the goal of the human being? Eudaimonia, that's what Aristotle called it. And I do think the Nicomachean Ethics, Alexander was taught the Nicomachean Ethics, and through that, eudaimonia, in its original form from Aristotle himself. And then everything else, Aristotle was probably a really expensive tutor, even though he was living in Macedonia at the time. And so King Philip was just like, all right, Aristotle, you go back and teach your own philosophy students, but at least teach my kid the Nicomachean Ethics, because Aristotle wrote it for his son, I believe. So King Philip was just like, okay, well, that instruction manual you wrote for your son, just teach my kid that. And then you can kind of just teach philosophy still. I think that's probably what happened. King Philip was the wise one. King Philip was the one who did it all right and was about to unite Greece, and then he died. And then Alexander took over and was like, wow, those Spartan guys are pretty tough, but I can be like Cyrus by just going over and taking his rotting empire. Wow, okay. His ossifying empire. And then build another one that barely lasts and disappears. Falls to the Romans, who then last a very long time. And the Ottomans and the Mongols didn't last as long. But, how long did Babylon last? Alexander took Babylon without burning it. Genghis Khan burned it, but Alexander didn't. He burned Persepolis, the capital of the Persian Empire. So, starting the new chapter, the main point of this part is to say that Philip, Alexander's father, is the one who set all the pieces in motion, and Alexander kind of carried it forward in a less perfect way. And one of Alexander's closest friends said that to Alexander's face, and Alexander put a spear through his chest and killed him, one of his top generals. And that's when he lost some of his other generals, because he killed him just for telling him what everyone knew to be was the truth. It's you want us to follow you, and yet if we tell you that your dad was basically he said you're nothing compared to your father. And that's the only reason why you're making us go all the way out to India. It was after they had burned Persepolis, so they were in Iran. And his men wanted to... They're see, you can tell that they're evolved from dinosaurs if you listen to the doves. So, they were at Persepolis. So they had taken out the Persian Empire, mind you, which was the only goal. And Alexander wanted to go east and go to India. And his men were like, why don't we just go home? We have more than we can ever leave. They wanted to go to Babylon, I think. Or Macedonia. They wanted to bring their wives. A lot of them, I'm sure by that time, had their wives in the caravan or had a lot of mistresses in the caravan. But they wanted to bring their Macedonian wives, either go back to Macedonia to go be with their families, or bring their families to Babylon and live like kings. So, yeah, or Alexandria, or Cairo. Alexander's greatest triumph was how he treated the Egyptians. He was flawless in diplomacy with the Egyptians, and it's why Alexandria survived, and the other, dozens of Alexandrias did not. He made so many Alexandrias, but the Egyptian one, he did it right. He played Egyptian politics perfectly. He respected their religion, and he was stern but fair. Stern but fair. And he left a stern but fair overseer. Just like Cyrus the Great, because Alexander was trying to copy him. His whole premise was that Cyrus the Great was awesome, but Darius, the current king, was just mooching off of Cyrus's greatness without being great. And Alexander was going to teach him that by just going and kicking his ass and taking his empire, being more like Cyrus. So Alexander was always concerned about being considered Cyrus's successor. And so when they took Persepolis, the Iranian, like the Persian capital, this is just my prequel, okay? I'm starting with this takeaway. Alexander was dressing in purple and acting all Persian because that's what he wanted to be, like Cyrus's champion. And he knelt before Cyrus's statue, I believe, for 5 days straight without leaving. He said, "Leave me alone." And he went to Cyrus's grave in Persepolis, I believe, and was there alone in prayer, basically, for 5 straight days. And he let his men burn Persepolis and rape the women, sell them into slavery, kill the men, rape the women and then sell them. Old school stuff, which they normally weren't allowed to do. But it was kind of like the finale. So they're there. And his men are like, "Why don't we go back home? Why do you want to keep going? What the hell? Not even Cyrus went that way. Why don't we go take the Spartans out? Why don't we go take..." It's like he didn't even have Bulgaria. It's like, okay, why don't we go take Bulgaria at least? Because they're like right next to Macedonia. And Alexander's like, "No." You have to remember, he's like 22, 23. He's just like, "No, I can take over the world." He wanted to go all the way to the people of the Yellow River. But I'll get to that. The people of the Yellow River are the Chinese, or are the Han. But we'll get to that. We'll get to that. My point is that that's kind of the context that this is all framed in. So when his friend / general told him, "Bro, your father would have done this better, man. He'd already have all the Balkan Peninsula. Your father would probably have all the barbarians under his control." The Macedonians were barbarians too. But, you can tell that they weren't really considered barbarians at the time because freaking Aristotle lived there. And he's like, "Yo, yeah, I'm going to live with the barbarians, the chill ones." And so just telling Alexander that, he threw a spear through his general's chest and killed him on the spot at a party. And everyone's just like, well, I get you're not supposed to talk to Alexander that way, but it's because he's a spoiled brat. He basically just called him a spoiled brat. And Alexander's like, "You little..." And one last thing to remember before we jump in, guys. And I'll just make a new video now. This will just be the intro to Alexander. One last thing to remember, guys. He rode into every battle on his horse, and he really did lead the charge, and he got hurt all the time. He risked his whole life on the battlefield. He could have just gotten hit by an arrow through the neck and died. Eventually, he does die of his injuries. Probably, maybe. But that's why he had to go home in India. Like, he fought. Whereas the Persian king sat back in the back with slaves and stuff. Alexander was on his horse in beautiful armor. Beautiful outfit. You can't even imagine how beautiful it was. His horse and everything on this god-tier cavalry supported by god-tier phalanx infantry. And pelters and everything. And just like some of the best military tacticians in history on his... or for that time, alive at the time, and his retinue. Because they had been fighting the Spartans for forever. If you're fighting the Spartans, you know how to win a battle. If you survive. So, the morale, right? It's like, who are the troops gonna... It's like, God, my guy's just a slave guy, and the only thing that these guys are fighting for isn't even to kill us. It's just to let us be in charge. So this is like a political war, and my emperor sitting in the back, chilling, wants me to die for him, and then this emperor is risking his life, literally, just on the front, just right there. You can see him. Wow, okay, I guess we'll just follow that guy. So he won with like outnumbered, I think it was like 50,000 to a million is like the extreme, like hyperbolic estimate. He was outnumbered like insanely. The Battle of Gilgamesh. You can look it up. So Alexander's like a, like a wild character. He's basically just like a spoiled brat who tried to take over the world. And his dad was awesome and set him up for greatness, but I think he fell short. So I don't call him Alexander the Great. If I really had to say, I would call him Alexander the Noble, or Alexander the Strong, or Alexander the Just, minus a couple things, or Alexander the Terrible. Because to me, Alexander the Terrible, it means that he was using violence to try to become something like a god figure. And that's like terror, he's inflicting terror. Because even if you tell someone, yo, I'm either going to torture you and burn you and sell you naked in a slave market, or you can be my friend, you're still using terror. So I would call him Alexander the Terrible. But it's not like a negative, like automatically the worst ever, because there's a lot of people like that in history. There's a lot of war generals, right? And, you don't want to go all the way so far as you're like, oh, Muhammad the Terrible, right? So there's a limit. But I think for Alexander, it's fair to say, like, Alexander the Terrible. So, yeah, thank you.